personality.
Andreen always getting high marks in school. I realized that Andreen is really bright. I was proud because, you see, my country is a laid-back place. So you have to really have ambition to really put your foot forward. She's a go-getter. That's what we call them in Jamaica. She's a go-getter.
May 2009, and Andreen meets 30-year-old Andre McDonald at a family event in Jamaica.
She called me one day and said, "Mommy, I meet somebody. He was a captain in the Air Force. He was living in America." So I said, "Oh, okay." So I said, "You like him?" And she said, "Yes, she liked him."
Born February.
Andre is at the cusp of his life. Andre knows what he wants and go at what he wants.
She do the laundry, she keep the house, and he loves her cooking.
Everybody always heard about the American dream. So she wants to get that American dream as well.
She was happy, and they were, I would say, no, on top of the world.
When Andre transfers to Lackland Air Base in 2010, the couple moved to San Antonio, Texas.
Andreen got a job for a water filtration company, and she also goes to University of Texas, San Antonio. And she was studying finance.
Then the newlyweds welcome a baby daughter into the family.
We were all excited. She was a very good mom. Andreen had loved her baby so much. Things was, started to bloom for both of them.
With Andreen juggling the baby and her studies, Maureen joins them in San Antonio.
Tensions start to grow.
At one point, Andreen had bought a laptop. She gave him the one that they were using before, and she take the new one, and he was upset. And he smashed the laptop, break it up, and threw it in the garbage. I was frightened. I was so shocked because I didn't expect him to behave like that. That's where I started to see a little rage in him. I would say Jamaican men don't like women with so much power. It's like it makes them feel less of a man. Well, I think that's what happened to Andre. And I said to her, if you're not happy or you're not comfortable, you need to leave. And she said, "Mommy, I'm okay, I can manage." She's not giving up. She's so determined. It's only death could stop that girl.
It's 2013, and Andreen's business, Starlight Homes, is growing, creating tension at home.
I found out about the cracks in the marriage from my mother because she lives in the home. And she will tell me that, they have a fight.
We get mad, and want to fight. Andreen is not backing down.
Well, when those things started to surface about his personality and his character, I am saying that those are red flags.
At one point, she was thinking of leaving him. This moment, they are okay. Next moment, they are not okay. Her business was moving. She was doing well.
In 2016, Andre is promoted to major and sent away for 6 months training in Biloxi, Mississippi.
In his absence, Andreen, I think she gets to reflect and absorb the type of person he is and try to get a better understanding of what the relationship is about and where it is going. When Andre comes back, the vibes was bittersweet. They were celebrating the promotion that he got. And also, she discussed with him that she wants her mother to have one of the homes. So when she come up with certain ideas that he doesn't agree on, they fussed about it. The fist knocking together all the time. And the new business that they built, it contributed to the fights. So as power increased, fight increased.
Reconciling for their daughter, the couple move into a new luxury home, just in time to celebrate Christmas 2017.
It's not yours.
Solitude Cove was Andreen's dream house. That's what she called it.
They were really happy to work. That's right. What's a jockey was in the one
Two Black people that aspire for their dreams and they achieve it. They're a power couple. The home is welcoming, inviting, and they're having parties.
Makeup? Okay, do mommy's makeup.
Makeup time.
Do mommy's cheeks.
She was so happy because it's like a dream come true.
Oh, pretty, thank you.
But there are times when you could tell that something is off as well.
Can mommy get kissed? Love you.
There's a lot of things that Andreen accumulate that would bring jealousy to him. At one point, Andreen was driving a Porsche, and he went and bought one of those Jaguars with the sunroof. I was saying to myself, it's a copycat thing.
I will kill me all time. Yo, Andreen, I will kill me all time. I run left.
After a fun run, Andre and Andreen reveal who won on social media.
Well, it's finally over, and as predicted,
I did come in before he did.
Right. Andreen did defeat me, and she is so excited.
He will laugh and behave like it doesn't bother him, but it does bothers him because Andreen is like running too close to him in everything, and she's not backing down.
Andreen did defeat me, and she is so excited.
He's thinking now that Andreen is getting more powerful than him.
My perception on Andreen and Andre is that they're both alpha types, and they're hitting head to head.
Andreen, I will kill me all time. Yo!
They're like in a boxing ring fighting.
She always says she's not leaving. He is the one that is going to leave. He's not going, and she's not going. You know, so it's like two determined human beings competing.
Help me welcome Andreen McDonald.
As Andreen's star continues to rise, she gives a motivational address at her old college.
She is still down to earth. She is still the same person that came from Jamaica.
They say you might get knocked down, but it's about getting back up and fighting and working hard so that you can accomplish your goals.
Sometimes I see her face upset, and she will say, "Mommy, I can't stand him." And I tell her, if you're not happy, leave. But Andreen is sort of stubborn, and she just thinks she can handle things.
Yeah. Come on, Dream. Yes, man.
If she's exercising, she's doing it perfect. If she's being a mother, she has to be perfect. If she's being a business entrepreneur, she has to be perfect. Everything that Andreen have inside of her, she just want to do everything perfect.
Yay! Yeah, Andreen. Good job, Dream. Proud of you. Thank you.
And that's the type of person Andreen is. Andre don't like it. I am getting the feeling with all of this that she wants to create an exit, but don't know how to.
She was doing well. Her business was moving. She was like a millionaire to me. They were a team, but it's like a competition in his mind. She was starting complaining about Andre, and sometimes they would fight. One of the time, she had stopped at a restaurant and she bought some food. And he was upset because she didn't give him some of that food. He gets so mad, knocks the pot out of the stove.
My understanding of Andre and Andreen's fussing is cursing and fighting and throwing words at each other. The fights got intense. Andre did get physical. They were driving from a friend's home. They were fighting, and he put his hand at her throat, like he was choking her and all that.
She had a swelling under her eye. I know he has anger, but all along, Andreen thinks she can manage.
I think at times she is afraid. Although she seemed to have that boldness and strong personality and stuff, there's something inside that is afraid. It's like she's screaming inside, but don't know how to let the scream out.
Happy birthday, dear mommy. Happy birthday to me. Blow it out, yay!
It's Andreen's 29th birthday, and Andre films her and their daughter.
For yourself. But God says, look out for others and I will look out for you.
Andreen uses her profile to do good work in the community.
She used to go downtown San Antonio, feed the homeless.
We will be providing meals for over 200 people. And I encourage other individuals who are out there that can make a difference to go out and help those in need.
That was a big program she had. That was one of our goals.
So this morning I'm here with Emmanuel Pentecostal Church, and we're on the side of the street this morning and we're giving out food for those less fortunate and who don't have food to eat this morning.
Andreen dealt with Andre's outbursts. She overworked herself to keep her mind occupied.
All the food is gone, so we're very thankful for everyone that came out and helped and everybody that donated.
Hi, my name is Andrea McDonald from Starlight Homes in Living.
She come here and she made her name in San Antonio as one of the youngest business person in San Antonio. Oh my God, she was so happy that day. It's like she was on top of the world, and we're all happy. She was too powerful. She had too much power. And I think he didn't like that. He thinks he owned her. I think when he think back, I am the one that brought her here. He couldn't stand the success. It was too much for him.
She trained every single day.
Stop. Come on, one more.
She started very early in the morning. We don't know exactly what was going on in her mind, but what we were seeing and what we were sensing, it's just like somebody crossing the road and a car's coming at full speed, and we are at the TV shouting, "Run, run, get out of the road." But the person is frozen, can't move.
It's February 2019, and Andre and Andrine host a party at home.
Andrine said to me, "Mommy, I'm gonna do a birthday party for Andre," because he was 40 at the time. And then did black and gold party. And it was so good. She just loved to do things, you know. And she was saying to herself that that's a good thing to do. That was a party that everybody talks about. It was such a grand time. And then after that happy time, then disaster.
"13 days after the party, Andrine does not turn up at work.
About 7 o'clock Friday morning, I got a call. One of the workers said to me, she's trying to get in touch with Andrine and she did not get a hold of her. Then we start to get worried.
Bexar County sheriffs receive a call from concerned friends and family.
We got a call for a welfare check. Some family members felt something was odd about not having been able to reach Andrine McDonald at that time. We initially responded. We made entry to the residence with the assistance of the family members. In the bedroom, there was what appeared to be a blood smear of some sort on the wall. Additionally, in the backyard of the residence, there seemed to be evidence that somebody had been burning something. Certainly somebody that's looking to get rid of clothing. You donate them to charity, you give them to a friend, you sell them in an estate sale or a garage sale. So that's certainly not something you would expect to find in the backyard of an affluent neighborhood like this, is a burn pile of some sort. The fact that you're burning them in a backyard, that's another factor that maybe by itself doesn't seem as suspicious, but you start adding it to all of the other things that are happening. We've got a very young, beautiful, very successful businesswoman that's missing. We know that friends feel like something is amiss. Andrine had said, if you're not able to find me, assume that something happened to me and Andre had something to do with it. And so really very early on in the investigation, we knew something was amiss. At this point, what we know is Andreen is missing. We're certainly not ruling out that she may have disappeared of her own free will. Maybe she was unhappy with her marriage. She decided to run away. But we're starting to look at evidence. Soon thereafter, Andre actually came to the scene. His story was that he had received a call that Andreen was injured. He said he went to the hospital. There was somebody there named McDonald. And he came back to us, told us, oh, she's fine, she's at the hospital. He was just assuming we were gonna take his word for it and say, oh, well, case closed. We found very quickly that story was not adding up. And then in fact, we did have a missing person on our hands.
Andre refuses to talk and lawyers up.
He's actually behaving not as somebody that's concerned for a missing wife. By the end of that first day, we were strongly suspicious that something bad happened to this woman, and this is the guy responsible for it. We collected the blood, we collected what was left of the remnants in the backyard. We didn't have enough to arrest him at that point, but what we did do was we left him there and we decided to watch.
When Andre leaves Solitude Cove, he's followed by covert surveillance.
He drove to Nagel's gun shop, which was in a whole other part of the county, actually in the city of San Antonio. Certainly something that raises even more red flags for us. Why is it a priority for him to be arming himself at this point? It could be that he's trying to plan an escape from town. Maybe he's going to end it all by killing himself. We made the decision at that point to take him down there outside the store. We knew we had to get him taken down to the ground quickly and get him immobilized to keep him from using any weapons he may have purchased inside the store.
Believing Andre is buying the gun to commit suicide, deputies detain him.
Being that he was an active duty Air Force officer, they were able to help us out with detaining him on base while we continued to conduct our investigation.
Air Force Command placed Andre under observation at San Antonio Military Medical Center for 72 hours. At Solitude Cove, deputies execute a second search warrant.
We found some things that had not been present the night before. Some gas cans that ended up having gasoline in them. Shovel. Large trash bags. And then we find a hammer with blood on it. These are all things that could be used to conceal a body, destroy evidence, destroy a body, whatever it may be. And in the trash can in the kitchen, we find the really key piece of evidence, receipts showing the purchase of some of these household items together. And then somebody went through the process of destroying these receipts, shredding it up into little pieces, throwing it into the trash can.
Deputies build a timeline of Andre's movements.
The receipts were from a Lowe's home improvement store several miles away. And we're able to see the fact that Andre was the one that purchased these items. We were also able to determine that he went to a bank and withdrew cash. I believe that he was trying to cover up a digital trail by purchasing those items in cash. We've got a lot of small bits of evidence, circumstantial evidence, if you will, the burned remnants of clothing, the blood stain in the bedroom. At this point, we think that he's already done quite a bit of work to conceal her from discovery. We couldn't prove up a murder, but we certainly had enough circumstantial evidence to charge him with tampering with physical evidence. And that's what he was arrested for.
Deputies take custody of Andre and transport him to Bexar County Jail.
We continued to comb the countryside literally for any other evidence that we could find. We're still desperately trying to find Andreen. Andreen lived in a high security community with a security gate at the front. So when somebody like that comes up missing, the community at large start to wonder, was she taken? Did somebody kidnap her? Do I and my family have something to worry about?
Our family is holding on to hope that a missing Texas mom will be found.
There was fear in all of us that she's dead. But we all were still having hope.
This weekend, investigators are searching a 28,000-acre military training site.
We have a huge county. It's about 1,200 square miles. We have got all kinds of different terrain in our county. We've got creeks, and up north, we've actually got the beginnings of what we call the Texas Hill Country. I have never been part of a search that was quite as big as the one for Andreen. Hundreds of civilian volunteers came out on foot, on horseback, in the little ATVs, with drones.
Something is definitely wrong now. Because it's the reality now facing me, you know. Because Andreen not gonna justice.
Andre McDonald, you see him there, charged with tampering with evidence in this case.
Several weeks later, we were able to confirm what we already suspected, that the blood found on the hammer, the blood found at the residence, was Andreen's blood. We had a whole bunch of circumstantial evidence, a lot of little pieces of evidence. What we were lacking was a body.
The husband of Andreen McDonald could be closer to leaving jail, even though no one knows exactly what happened to his wife.
After a month in jail, Andre is released on bail.
I did not like the fact that somebody that we strongly believe murdered his wife and disposed of the body is now not behind bars. Whatever was done to it, we feel pretty strongly that it's going to be very difficult to find her body.
Well, search crews are reportedly zeroing in on an area in their search for a missing Texas mom.
It was just a freak circumstance that everything came together, and it came about in the weirdest way possible. Months prior, a cow had died of natural causes in the middle of a field. We had a rancher that was working on a property. As he went to the remains of the cow, he found what appeared to be human remains intermingled and under the cow remains. A body of a woman found partially burned. And we all thought, okay, this is it, we found her. The bones themselves are about 20 feet behind me. We want to photo document everything in place before we start the collection process. Relying upon dental records, our medical examiner was able to positively identify these remains as belonging to Andreen McDonald.
I went out there. They like tape off the road, you know. The way my heart was so full, I could even cry. There was no eye water.
The burned clothing, the blood on the wall, the gasoline, the torn up receipts, the video evidence, crushing injuries to her bones, broken back, broken ribs. And you put all these things together, and you've got a pretty strong case of murder.
Completely lose a signal. It's my assertion that he's already killed her.
Andre's trial is set for January 2023.
Knowing what took place in that bedroom back February 28th to March 1st, 2019 was going to be a difficult aspect. The medical examiner determined that it was homicidal violence was the cause of death. I felt that if the two of them were going to get into a fight, both of them would have injuries. When the sheriff's office came and examined him on March 1st, 2019, Andre did not have injuries to him. Certainly indicated to me that he perhaps caught her unawares or hit her from behind. From the spinal injuries and from where they were, it was consistent with getting struck in the back, near the base of the neck.
I think that she was ready to leave. And I believe that that's why he killed her that night, is because he didn't want her to go.
Based on the evidence, prosecutors make the case for premeditated murder. However, Andre claims self-defense.
Are you Major Andre McDonald, the United States Air Force Reserve?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I've cross-examined many people. His lack of remorse was shocking to me. It was almost unhuman.
When she comes, she's like throwing like some punches. I remember like grabbing her and like tripping her over one of my legs.
She fell on the floor. He said that he stomped her.
He's confirming he is the one responsible for her death.
He did everything in his power to try to cover up this crime, and now it's self-defense.
As soon as she fell, it was like a reaction, you know, so I landed like a couple of kicks, and then I put my ear next to like her nose to see if she was breathing, and she was not.
We have the words from his mouth that he killed Andreen. And so then the question becomes, was he justified in doing that?
I grabbed like a couple of trash bags, and then I put one over the top of her and then the other one on the...
Andre tells the jury he acts in self-defense and returns to Andreen's body after her death.
So at that point, I poured like the gas on her and I lit the fire.
I just can't believe it was my little sister. The thought just kills me inside.
I asked him repeatedly, why? Why did you do this? Why did you set the mother of your child's body on fire?
You know, she's dead on the floor. Obviously, you know, I'm gonna get blamed for this.
He would not call her by name. He would not say Andreen. He would say the body.
And I just got really pissed off. I started like, you know, hitting the body with the hammer.
We heard everything that he said. It was so disgusting. So disgusting.
I think the real Andre McDonald started to show up as I questioned him.
I used a claw and like hit her in the neck area.
I just could not believe the words that were coming out of his mouth.
I remember that the claw got stuck in like her neck, and then that's when I was like ripping the hammer out.
It was like a depravity. Like he wanted us to see it the way he saw it. It was like sitting and looking at evil.
But as I'm like trying to like walk away, I give me like one more whack somewhere on the body. I'm not sure where that landed.
So I can't look at it. I thought I could right now. I thought I was over it.
I can't imagine that he would have done something so horrendous. Only a monster would do something like that.
One of the things that Andre took away from us when he hid her body the way that he did is he took away the certainty about the manner in which she died.
Prosecutors lack evidence to definitively disprove Andre's self-defense testimony.
That ultimately proved to be the reason the jury decided on manslaughter as opposed to murder.
Andre is found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years.
It was a shock. This does not make any sense. Andreen does not deserve this.
This is the victim impact statement. You destroyed our lives. Not only are you a murderer, you are a thief.
Can mommy get a kiss?
You stole a daughter from her mother.
Love you.
You stole from everyone who would have been blessed by her gifts to this world.
But it's about getting back up and fighting.
You have killed her more than words.
It glowed amber against stucco walls. Ceiling fans hummed above tidy kitchens where dishes dried beside the sink. People lived in tract homes built on the promise that ordinary life could be engineered into safety. Cul-de-sacs, school districts, fresh paint, backyard fences, bicycles left on their sides in the grass. Night, in those neighborhoods, was supposed to be a soft thing. It was supposed to settle over the houses like a blanket, but for some families, in some parts of Northern and then Southern California, night became a waiting room for terror. The first thing to understand about this story is that it did not begin with a body, it began with intrusion. With violation, with the unbearable intimacy of a stranger standing inside a home while the people in that home were asleep. There are crimes that arrive like explosions, obvious and immediate, tearing the world open in one hot second. And then there are crimes like these, which spread like a stain in the dark, unnoticed at first, growing from one address to the next, one woman to the next, one couple to the next, until fear itself becomes a second resident in the neighborhood. He was not a myth when he started. He was a man. He drove roads that everyone else drove. He likely passed grocery stores, schools, gas stations, intersections where mothers waited with children in the back seat and office workers stopped for coffee on the way home. He knew how to look ordinary, which in stories like this is often the most frightening skill of all, because ordinary men are invited into memory without resistance. Ordinary men are not remembered by the clerk at the counter, not watched by the neighbor across the street, not suspected when they slow down in a quiet suburb and study a house as if they are just lost. Yet behind that ordinary exterior was a patient so cold it bordered on ritual. He watched, he learned schedules. He learned where people slept, when they locked up, when they forgot. He moved in rehearsal before he moved in violence. And that is what makes the opening of this story so unnerving, long before anyone knew they were living beside a serial offender. Long before police departments understood that one offender could be stalking communities across years, the groundwork was already being laid in silence. A backyard crossed, a window tested, a phone call made to unsettle, footsteps in a side yard that vanished before anyone reached the curtains. The neighborhoods he haunted were places built around routine. In the morning, there were sprinklers ticking over lawns and newspapers slapped onto driveways. Children left for school with lunches wrapped in paper and keys on shoelaces around their necks. Men loosened ties when they came home, and women folded laundry while televisions glowed in living rooms with the evening news. Even the architecture of those streets reflected a particular kind of late 20th century American faith. Bedrooms were not fortresses. Sliding doors opened to patios. Windows were left cracked to let in air. People believed, not stupidly but naturally, that privacy and safety were cousins. If the door was locked, if the curtains were drawn, if the neighborhood was decent, then home meant protected. That belief is what he targeted most effectively. Not just bodies, not just homes. The idea of home itself. That is why this story lingers so powerfully in the imagination. Even decades later, the crimes associated with Joseph James DeAngelo were horrific in their scale and in their cruelty. Yes, but what made them uniquely haunting was the way they unfolded inside the most intimate geography of ordinary life. Bedrooms, hallways, children's rooms nearby, lamps turned off hours earlier, the smell of detergent still clinging to sheets, the low electric buzz of alarm clocks on bedside tables. In true horror, the monster does not leap from the woods. He steps out of the familiar. By the time California began trying to name what was happening, the fear had already evolved faster than the language. At first, he was a burglar, then a prowler, then a rapist, then something larger and more unknowable, because the crimes kept changing form while preserving the same core chill. Women were terrorized in their own homes. Couples were bound in rooms they had furnished together. Rooms that still carried the warmth of dinner, conversation, domestic life. Later, murders followed. Then distance itself joined the confusion. How could crimes separated by counties, by methods that seemed similar and yet transformed, by gaps in time and by changing nicknames, belong to one person? That is one of the reasons this case would eventually become historic. It was not only the brutality, it was the shape-shifting, the way the offender seemed to move through different chapters of criminal identity while staying fundamentally the same man. It was as if law enforcement and the public were not chasing a single figure, but a sequence of apparitions wearing slightly different masks. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, much later, the wider name that pulled them together under one monstrous umbrella, the Golden State Killer. But in the beginning, there was no umbrella. There was only dread. The hook in this story, the part that tightens around the throat before the facts even settle, lies in that dread. Imagine a house after midnight in suburban California in the 1970s, summer heat still trapped in the walls, a screen door faintly vibrating when the breeze shifts, a woman asleep, or trying to sleep, not knowing that outside, beyond the dark of the yard, someone has already chosen her house. Perhaps chosen it days earlier. Imagine the offender standing still long enough for his breathing to slow, listening to the life inside, not rushing. Never rushing when he does not have to. That patience tells you almost everything you need to know before the case file ever says his name. This is not the frenzy of a man losing control. It is the discipline of a man who has made terror into a private craft. He did not simply attack people. He entered their world step by step, stripping away each layer of safety in an order only he controlled. First, the anonymity of the street, then the edge of the yard, then the house, then the room, then the body, then the mind. And because he repeated that pattern across years, across different communities, he did more than create victims. He created an atmosphere, a climate of fear that spread beyond the homes he entered. Women slept less, husbands checked locks again and again. Police cars moved more slowly through neighborhoods, people bought dogs, floodlights, firearms, new curtains, stronger window latches. But underneath all those gestures was a more humiliating truth. No one knew exactly who they were defending against. There is a special terror in a criminal who remains unresolved. When a killer is quickly identified, fear still burns, but it burns around a known shape. Here, the shape kept slipping away. Survivors often remembered details, fragments, voice, movement, smell, the pressure of a hand, the rhythm of breathing, the strange and chilling familiarity with which he navigated their homes. Yet memory, especially memory born in terror, arrives in broken shards. Detectives gathered them. News outlets circulated them. Sketch artists tried to give them a face. But a face is only useful when it belongs to a single life. D'Angelo lived for years outside that frame, protected partly by the era itself. This was a time before surveillance cameras covered every angle of a neighborhood, before digital trails mapped the ordinary life of a suspect, before genetic genealogy cracked open old cases with the ruthless intimacy of science. In those earlier decades, an offender with enough caution, enough mobility, enough luck, and enough understanding of police limitations could vanish into the ordinary and stay there. And that, too, belongs in the opening of this story. Because the hook is not only that a predator stalked California, it is that he was allowed by the limits of the time, and by his own discipline to do it over and over again while life continued around him. People got married, children grew up. Houses were sold, detectives retired. Files thickened, survivors aged. The man responsible went on living. There is something almost unbearable about that fact when you sit with it long enough. Somewhere, while one victim was trying to remember the sound of his whisper, and another family was burying someone they loved. He was buying groceries, mowing a lawn, making himself invisible inside the landscape of ordinary American adulthood. He had once worn a badge. That detail lands with the particular weight even before the story fully unfolds, because if home is supposed to be the final line of safety, then the image of a man tied to law enforcement crossing that line in secret carries a deeper contamination. It suggests not merely criminality, but knowledge weaponized. Knowledge of procedure, knowledge of fear, knowledge of how victims respond, how evidence is lost, how investigations slow. Whether he consciously exploited every professional skill he had is almost beside the point in the emotional architecture of the case. The point is that he understood systems from the inside and still chose, repeatedly, to place himself on the darkest side of them. That contradiction gives the story an added chill. The figure at the center is not some gothic drifter, not a cinematic phantom with no place in normal society. He is more frightening than that. He is integrated. He belongs somewhere. He can stand in daylight without setting off alarm. And because of that, his nights become even harder to imagine. One of the most disturbing features of these crimes is how much they depended on anticipation. He did not just want access. He wanted psychological occupation. In some cases, there were signs of prowling before the attack, small disturbances, hangs up on the phone, movement in shadows. The sensation, hard to prove and harder to dismiss, that someone had been there before the crime itself. This transformed his violence into something larger than an event. It became a siege. Victims were not only attacked in a single catastrophic moment, some were first made to live in the outskirts of fear, made to feel that their homes were being observed, measured, tested. That is the true beginning of terror. And it belongs in the hook because it tells us exactly what kind of predator this was. Not impulsive, not merely opportunistic, but invasive in the deepest possible sense. He wanted entry not only into physical space, but into mental space. He wanted to remain after he was gone. And he did, for years. For decades. That is why, in telling this story, we cannot begin with his arrest in 2018. As dramatic and historically important as that moment was, we have to begin with the darkness he created long before science caught up to him. We have to begin with the sound of a neighborhood settling for the night, with curtains drawn and dishes done and children asleep. While somewhere nearby, a man is already deciding which life he will invade next. We have to begin with the discrepancy between the world as it appeared and the world as it actually was. Appeared. Safe. Sunlit, California. Upwardly mobile. Suburban. Routine. Actually, a hunting ground mapped by one patient offender. That discrepancy is the soul of the hook. It is what transforms the story from a list of crimes into a descent. Because once you understand that the threat was moving quietly through the very spaces people trusted most, everything ordinary begins to feel charged. A side gate is no longer just a side gate. A late-night phone ring is no longer just wrong number static. A creak in the house is no longer settling wood. The opening of this case is therefore not a single scene, but a feeling spreading house by house. A state that does not yet know it is sharing one nightmare. Women waking to find a flashlight beam. Men realizing, too late, that being present is not the same as being able to protect. Police hearing similar accounts but still trapped in the limits of geography and naming. Reporters trying to summarize what the public can barely bear to picture. And over all of it, the offender's greatest ally, time. Time before connection, time before certainty. time before a full pattern could be seen, time in which he remained not a solved man but a roaming absence. A force without a face, the hook of the Golden State Killer story. Then, is not simply that Joseph James DeAngelo committed many crimes. It is that for years he lived in the gap between terror and recognition. He existed as a series of midnight intrusions, of voices heard in the dark, of survivors trying to explain the inexplicable, of detectives staring at separate files that would one day collapse into one terrible silhouette. And in those years, while California slept behind locked doors and thought locked doors meant something, a man was teaching an entire generation of victims that safety could be peeled away in layers. Quietly, carefully, by someone who understood exactly how long fear can live after footsteps disappear, to understand how this story became one of the most haunting and historically important crime sagas in the United States. You have to begin with California before the name Golden State Killer existed, before the maps were connected, before the crimes were linked across years and regions, before a retired man in a quiet neighborhood became the answer to a question that had tormented victims for decades. You have to begin with a place that looked, on the surface, like a promise. In the 1970s, much of California still sold itself as a landscape of possibility. New subdivisions spread outward in tidy rows. Citrus-scented air in some towns mixed with the smell of fresh asphalt and cut grass. Schoolyards filled with children under hard blue skies. There were bicycles tipped over on front lawns, backyard pools behind redwood fences, station wagons in driveways, and a certain middle-class confidence that if you worked hard enough, bought into the right neighborhood, and kept your life orderly, your home would become the safest place in the world. This was not a fantasy unique to California. But California gave it a special brightness. The state looked expansive, modern, and domestic all at once. It felt like a place where danger belonged elsewhere, out on highways, in bad districts, in the shadowy places people warned each other about. It was not supposed to live in cul-de-sacs. It was not supposed to slip through side gates and bedroom windows. It was not supposed to study family routines with the patience of a hunter, and yet that is exactly where the story took root. The setting of this case matters because these crimes were not committed in abandoned alleys or lawless frontiers. They were committed in ordinary neighborhoods that had been built around routine, privacy, and trust in the architecture of daily life. The houses were often modest but comfortable, inhabited by people whose days were organized by work, errands, dinner, television, school schedules, and sleep. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in such settings because the danger is not anticipated. The homeowner does not feel like prey. The woman folding clothes in the evening or checking a lock before bed does not think of herself as part of some larger criminal pattern. She thinks she is simply living. That ordinariness is crucial to the background of this case. DeAngelo did not descend on landscapes already marked as threatening. He entered places where people had every reason to believe they were safe. And in doing so, he turned the domestic world itself into part of the terror, before the public would know him as the Golden State Killer. The regions touched by his crimes had their own local rhythms and identities. In and around Visalia in the Central Valley, there was a different texture to life than in the Sacramento suburbs, and different, again, from the communities of Southern California that would later enter the same nightmare. But all of these places shared one thing. They were made of private routines. Neighbors recognized one another's cars. People noticed when a garage door was opened too late or a porch light stayed off. Dogs barked at night because that is what dogs do in neighborhoods where fences and property lines define the edges of daily life. The first phase associated with the offender, often discussed through the crimes linked to the Visalia ransacker, unfolded in a California that still relied heavily on local boundaries to define criminal understanding. A burglar in one area was investigated as a burglar in that area. A prowler in one county belonged to that county's headache. Law enforcement agencies had fewer tools for rapidly integrating pattern recognition across jurisdictions, fewer databases, fewer technological shortcuts, fewer ways to collapse scattered reports into a unified and living portrait. This limitation is not just a technical footnote, it is part of the background that allowed the offender's long evolution. He benefited from the gaps between towns, between departments, between labels, between what one detective suspected and what another could prove. California itself, vast and regionally diverse, helped him remain fragmented in the public imagination. In one place, he was one kind of menace. Elsewhere, he seemed like another, and in that fragmentation lay his protection. The 1970s were also a transitional period in American ideas about crime and private life. Popular culture still carried strong assumptions about the sanctuary of the home. But beneath that surface, anxieties were growing. Urban unrest, changing gender roles, distrust in institutions after Vietnam and Watergate, and a rising awareness of violent crime all fed a broader national unease. Yet in suburban communities, especially among families trying to build stable lives, that unease often existed as background noise rather than immediate reality. People were alert in abstract ways, but not yet transformed by the kind of dread that comes from a predator invading homes repeatedly. Women were told to be careful, but many still lived inside a social world where the expectation of domestic safety remained deeply ingrained. Men were often raised with a strong idea of themselves as protectors of household space. One of the reasons these crimes became so psychologically devastating is that they attacked both assumptions at once. Women discovered that locked doors and social order did not guarantee safety. Men discovered that physical presence alone did not ensure protection. That collapse of role and expectation would become one of the most poisonous legacies of the case. But in the beginning, it was still only background. California's climate and physical environment also shaped the crimes in more subtle ways. Warm nights meant windows were sometimes left open or only lightly secured. Houses built for airflow and suburban ease did not always feel like fortresses. Single-story layouts, sliding doors, side yards, and fences created opportunities for movement and concealment. Dry summers preserved outdoor traces in strange ways, while also encouraging habits of openness. A yard at midnight in California is not the same as a frozen yard in a harsher climate. The air carries sound differently. A person can wait in relative comfort in the dark. A prowler can study a home from beyond a fence line or behind shrubbery without attracting immediate attention. Even the sensory profile matters. Crickets, distant traffic, sprinklers, the rustle of ornamental plants, dogs reacting to movement no human yet notices. All of it creates a stage on which an offender skilled in patience can disappear into what seems like normal nighttime atmosphere. The background of this case is therefore not just social and geographic, but sensory. These crimes happened in a landscape that often looked calm, warm, and quietly prosperous. The terror entered not by replacing that landscape, but by corrupting it. A phone call in the middle of the night, footsteps in the yard, a gate creaking, a flashlight beam cutting through darkness. These things only become monstrous because they emerge out of surroundings that were supposed to be benign. The deeper background also includes the offender's own trajectory. Before he was publicly identified, before the world understood how one man might connect a sequence of burglaries, rapes, and murders across time, Joseph James DeAngelo was building a life that outwardly fit within ordinary social structures. He served in the military. He later worked in law enforcement. That matters enormously. Not because it automatically explains his crimes, but because it deepens the contamination at the heart of the case. Here was not a man wholly alien to the systems meant to maintain public order, but a man who understood those systems from within. He knew discipline. He knew procedure. He knew, at least to some degree, how authority is performed and how response is structured. Even if one strips away every dramatic flourish, the fact remains chilling in its simplicity. The offender moved through the world with some understanding of institutions, while privately cultivating a life of intrusion and domination. It is difficult to overstate how much that changes the emotional background of the story. A burglar from nowhere is frightening enough. A predator who may understand the rhythms and blind spots of law enforcement is something more corrosive. He becomes not just a criminal, but a distortion inside the civic body itself. If the early background belongs partly to homes and neighborhoods, it also belongs to the era's investigative limitations. Today, people often imagine crime patterns as immediately searchable, linkable, visible from one screen. But in the years when these crimes were unfolding, pattern recognition depended on human memory, departmental communication, and the willingness of investigators to look past the constraints of local naming. A sexual assault series in one area could remain intellectually separate from a murder series elsewhere, especially when media labels reinforced the separation. One of the most important background truths of the Golden State Killer case is that the offender's mythology was created not only by his actions, but by the slowness with which those actions could be assembled into one coherent structure. The East Area Rapist was already terrifying enough as a local phenomenon. The original Night Stalker brought another layer of dread. The possibility that these identities might be linked was, for a long time, difficult for many to fully establish or accept. This meant victims and communities suffered within narrower narratives, while the offender benefited from the broader disunity of perception. He did not need to be invisible in an absolute sense. He only needed to remain ununified. That is often enough for a patient predator. There is also a gendered background to this story that cannot be ignored. The crimes emerged in a period when sexual violence was still often misunderstood, minimized, or discussed in ways that placed crushing burdens on victims. Women reporting assaults risked not only trauma, but scrutiny, shame, and suspicion. The idea of a serial sexual predator operating with calculated method inside suburban homes challenged not only police procedure, but social assumptions. It forced people to confront the fact that sexual violence was not always impulsive, not always confined to stereotyped, dangerous spaces, and not always committed by obvious monsters lurking at the margins of society. It could be methodical. It could be domestic in setting. It could be committed by a man who looked ordinary in daylight and who understood the emotional anatomy of fear better than many of the people trying to stop him. The setting and background of this case therefore include not just neighborhoods and years, but the social limits of what many people were ready to see. Survivors often knew before institutions did that they had encountered a certain kind of person. A person who was not merely attacking bodies but staging fear. He called, prowled, watched, entered, controlled. He used time, ritual, and terror like tools, but institutions often need repetition, evidence, and categorization before they can fully name what victims feel in a single night. Another crucial aspect of the background is how these communities changed under pressure. Once the attacks became known, neighborhoods did not remain psychologically the same. Porch lights stayed on longer. Men bought guns. Women checked windows twice, then 3 times. Parents began thinking differently about children sleeping down the hall. Police patrols were watched not with casual gratitude, but with desperate expectation. People discussed crime at block-level intimacy, not as news, but as environmental threat. The atmosphere thickened. Some slept lightly, some not at all. Some listened for every tiny sound in the yard. This transformation belongs partly to the setting because it shows how the offender's crimes altered the landscape without physically changing it. The same houses stood, the same trees cast shadows, the same streets curved under street lamps, but the meaning of those spaces had shifted. The setting was no longer merely suburban California. It had become a territory of anticipation. Any dog bark might mean something. Any late-night movement might be him. Fear turned geography personal, and because these changes happened unevenly over years, one town at a time, the state itself became a patchwork of dread. With some communities farther along in that education than others, the background to the eventual Golden State Killer label is therefore also the background of unshared knowledge. One victim knew one version of him. One detective knew one cluster of attacks. One neighborhood knew one kind of fear. The totality was hidden in pieces. When people now look back on the case as one vast saga, there is a temptation to flatten the background into inevitability, as if the pattern was always waiting to be seen. But on the ground, inside those years, it was much messier. Investigators had to fight geography, bureaucracy, uncertainty, and the offender's own evolution. Victims had to fight trauma, disbelief, and the burden of surviving something difficult to explain to people who had not lived it. Communities had to learn that a place can remain visually normal while becoming psychologically ruined. This is why the setting matters so much. The crimes did not erupt in a landscape already coded as lawless. They erupted in the middle of aspiration, in communities that had invested emotionally and financially in the idea of safe domestic life. The offender did not merely attack individuals. He occupied the seam between public optimism and private terror, and all of this unfolded against the broad, sunlit mythology of California itself. That contrast gave the case a particular power. The state was known globally as glamorous, modern, fertile, open. Yet here, under that brightness, was a man moving through bedrooms, backyards, and shadows with methodical cruelty. The contrast is almost unbearable, the longer you sit with it. Daytime California sold promise, nighttime California. For some families, concealed a stalker. By the time the case would eventually become historic for its use of genetic genealogy, the background had stretched across decades. But in part 2, in the setting and background, what matters most is not the ending but the groundwork, the houses, the era, the investigative limitations, the social assumptions, the state itself, and the man moving quietly through all of it before the world knew his name. Before science would drag that name out of the dark, Joseph James DeAngelo lived inside a California that gave him exactly what he needed. Space, fragmentation, ordinary neighborhoods, and time. Time to prowl, time to rehearse. Time to become different monsters under different names. Time to let fear spread faster than certainty. And in that long stretch of time, California did what many places do before a pattern is recognized. It kept living. Families kept buying homes. Children kept sleeping down the hall. Evening news anchors kept moving on to the next story. Detectives kept filing reports under local titles. Men kept believing they could protect the people they loved simply by being present. Women kept trying to trust the locks they turned each night. That is the background in its truest form. Not merely a setting for future violence, but a living world that did not yet understand how deeply it had already been entered. The most difficult truth about this case is that there is no single victim story that can hold all of its weight. There is no one face that can stand in for every shattered night. No one household that can contain the full emotional geography of what Joseph James DeAngelo took from California over those years. To tell the victim's story here is to resist the temptation to simplify. It is to understand that this was not one crime with one aftermath, but a long campaign of violation that moved through different lives. Different neighborhoods, different stages of adulthood, different kinds of hope. Some victims were young women living alone, still building the shape of their futures. Some were wives and mothers sleeping beside husbands who believed their presence meant safety. Some were couples whose homes had been arranged around ordinary domestic rhythms and who woke to discover that their bedrooms had become theaters of humiliation and terror later. Some victims were people who would not survive at all, their names carried forward by families who were forced to imagine final moments they never witnessed. So the victim's story in this case must be told like a constellation rather than a portrait, not one biography, but many lights, each one extinguished or darkened in a different way. Each one revealing the same terrible fact. What DeAngelo attacked most consistently was not just the body, but the private self, the sense of refuge, the continuity of life before and after sleep, before any police sketch, before any genetic breakthrough, before the world knew the name Joseph James DeAngelo. There were women lying in bed in ordinary houses, thinking ordinary final thoughts before sleep. Thoughts about work the next day, or unfinished chores, or a conversation that had gone slightly wrong at dinner, or whether the weather would warm up by the weekend, or whether the dog had been let out, or whether they had remembered to sign a school form, or whether the neighbor's music seemed louder than usual, this is where the victim's story has to begin. Not with the attack, but with the ordinary life that existed right up to the edge of it. Because what makes these crimes so haunting is not only their violence, it is the intimacy of what they interrupted. The woman brushing her hair in the bathroom mirror before bed was not a symbol. The couple turning off the last lamp and mumbling one final sentence into the dark were not yet part of a case file. They were living. They were inside the dense, invisible fabric of normality, which is exactly what made the rupture so devastating. Many of the survivors later carried not only memories of what happened during the crimes, but memories of what happened just before them. Those memories matter: a bedside clock glowing red, sheets still warm from sleep, the soft weight of a comforter, the smell of soap on skin, a child asleep in the next room, the low hum of a refrigerator somewhere down the hall. These are the textures of private life. And they belong to the victims as much as the violence does. In some cases, the victims were women alone, already navigating the vulnerable freedom of independent adulthood in a culture that still often underestimated the threats women faced in private space. A woman living by herself creates rituals of safety without necessarily calling them that. Check the lock. Turn out the kitchen light. Pull the curtains. Leave shoes near the bed. Maybe read for a few minutes. Maybe listen to the quiet of the house. The crime, when it came, did not simply injure her. It reached backward and poisoned every one of those rituals. A lock became evidence of insufficiency. A curtain became something too thin. A familiar hallway became a route someone else had learned. Survivors of home invasion sexual assaults often describe a lifelong alteration in the meaning of ordinary objects, and this case was filled with exactly that kind of theft. A bedroom never becomes fully innocent again after a stranger has entered it with intent to dominate. A window never returns to being just a window. The victims carried these transformations in silence long after the news cycle moved on. For women attacked while living alone, the aftermath often included a cruel kind of social invisibility. They had survived, which to outsiders sometimes looked like the end of the story. But surviving this kind of offender meant carrying a private occupation of the mind. Sleep changed. Dating changed. Silence in a house changed. Trust changed. Some likely developed habits that made sense only to them, checking locks in a particular order, leaving lights on, avoiding certain neighborhoods, waking at small sounds, sitting with their backs to walls. To tell the victim's story honestly means recognizing that for many survivors, the attack did not end when he left. It lodged itself into the nervous system and continued there, year after year, long after the state itself had changed around them. For couples, the victim's story becomes even more layered. In those cases, D'Angelo attacked not only the individual body, but the architecture of shared life. A bedroom shared by two adults is one of the most intimate spaces human beings create. It contains not only furniture and routine, but trust, habit, and an unspoken belief in mutual protection. Couples sleep beside one another because the sleeping body is allowed to become defenseless in the presence of love. That is one of the deepest domestic contracts people enter without ever formally naming it. D'Angelo shattered that contract. Men were forced into helpless witness. Women were assaulted in rooms where marriage, partnership, or companionship should have meant safety. And afterward, both people had to go on living with a terrible and often unspeakable inversion. The place where they had once felt closest could become the place where they felt most exposed. For male partners, the trauma often carried an extra layer of corrosive shame, not because they had failed in any moral sense, but because the social role of protector had been used against them. For women, the pain was even more intimate, because violation occurred under forced proximity to someone they loved, turning companionship into part of the crime's emotional machinery. These were not only attacks, they were engineered humiliations. That matters in a victim-centered telling because it reveals the psychological precision of what was inflicted. The victims were not randomly damaged. They were deliberately made to feel that every sacred domestic role had collapsed at once. husband, wife, protector, beloved, sleeper, homeowner, parent, all of it contaminated. And yes, in some homes there were children nearby, sleeping down the hall, in another room, close enough that their existence changed every emotional calculation. That detail is one of the hardest to sit with because it reveals how profoundly the victims had to think beyond their own survival, even in the midst of terror. A mother under assault may also be listening for whether her child wakes. A father being controlled may be thinking not only of his partner, but of what is happening a few yards away in the next bedroom. The victims in this case were often forced to hold two realities at once: immediate terror and protective love. That split is psychologically punishing. It means the crime enters not only the victim's sense of self, but their sense of parenthood, responsibility, and memory. Afterward, how does a mother remember a hallway her child once walked down at night? How does a father hear a house settle after midnight and not feel his body tense? These are victim stories too. Not just the moments of violence, but the decades of altered domestic feeling that followed. The later murders added another unbearable dimension. At that point, the victim's story includes not only survivors, but the dead. And with the dead comes the particular grief of reconstruction. Families of homicide victims often live partly inside imagination. They imagine final evenings, final glances, final words, final sounds in the house, final routines interrupted. In this case, because the offender had already established patterns of intrusion and control, those imagined final moments became even darker. Loved ones had to reckon with not just loss, but with the possibility that the person they lost had endured a sequence of terror before death. This is one of the reasons the case stayed so alive for so long. It was not only unsolved in a technical sense, it was emotionally unfinished for the families. There is a special cruelty in unsolved violent crime because it traps victims and survivors inside a suspended moral state. The world knows something monstrous happened, but not to whom that monstrosity belongs. The dead cannot be fully accompanied into public memory because the figure responsible remains faceless. In the decades before D'Angelo's arrest, many of the victims' families lived inside that suspension. They had names, photographs, homes, birthdays, funerals, but not the final answer. It is impossible to overstate how much that absence matters. Some victims in this case were very young when attacked. Their stories include not only the event itself, but the long relationship between trauma and adulthood. To be assaulted in the formative years of life and then age in a world where the offender remains unidentified is to live alongside a kind of unfinished sentence. Relationships may be shaped by it. Sexuality may be shaped by it. Trust may be shaped by it. Even success or outward composure does not erase the subterranean effects. A person can build a career, raise children, move cities, laugh at parties, appear entirely functional, and still carry inside them a room they never really left. That room might be a bedroom in Sacramento, or a hallway in another county, or a house no longer standing, but psychologically, it remains furnished. Many survivors of these crimes became, in effect, long-term custodians of scenes the public would never see in full detail. They carried the sensory memory, the voice, the movement, the smell, the breathing, the fear, the waiting. That is part of their victim story, and it deserves to be held with seriousness rather than consumed as spectacle. There is also a collective victim story here, one that belongs to neighborhoods and communities. Fear does not stop neatly at the walls of a single house. When an offender like this is active, every nearby resident becomes a partial victim of uncertainty. Women sleep less soundly, men become hypervigilant. Children absorb tension they may not understand. Neighbors glance longer at passing cars. People start to suspect sounds they once ignored. In that sense, the victims in this case include not only those directly attacked, but the rings of people whose lives were bent around the possibility of being next. Yet it is crucial not to let the collective story blur the individuals. The community suffered because individuals were first targeted. And each individual had a life before they became part of this case, a favorite chair in the living room, a usual jogging route, a particular way of laughing at the dinner table, a pregnancy, a wedding photograph on a dresser, a stack of library books beside the bed, a habit of sleeping with one foot outside the covers. These details may seem small, but they are morally important. They resist the flattening effect of serial crime narratives, where victims can otherwise become numbers, locations, or chapter markers in the offender's progression. If we care about the victims, we have to let them remain textured. One of the most heartbreaking elements of this case is how it intersected with female intuition and male dismissal in the social climate of the time. Some women likely sensed something before an attack. A wrongness in a phone call, a movement in the yard, a feeling of being watched. Such sensations are often difficult to translate into language others take seriously. That too belongs to the victim's story, the burden of not only experiencing danger but trying to persuade others that danger is real. The burden of later wondering if some tiny sign had been misread or not read strongly enough. Trauma often recruits hindsight as a tormentor. Victims ask themselves impossible questions. Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I notice that? Why didn't I insist? But the moral burden belongs entirely elsewhere. It belongs to the man who cultivated those conditions on purpose. The survivors did not fail to decode him. He exploited the limits of what a normal person should ever have to imagine, in a broader emotional sense. The victim's story here is also a story about stolen futures, not only the futures of those murdered, but the futures of those who survived in changed form. A woman may have survived and gone on to build a life, but the future she would have inhabited without the attack is gone forever. A couple may have stayed together, but the marriage they would have had before that bedroom was breached no longer exists in pure form. A family may have raised children successfully, but parenthood under the shadow of such trauma is different from parenthood untouched by it. We often think of violent crime in terms of immediate harm, but serial predation is also a machine for producing alternate lives, lives redirected by fear, caution, therapy, rage, secrecy, or grief. The victim's story, then, is not bounded by the night itself. It stretches into years, into sleep disorders, into divorces or deeper bonds, into legal testimony, into the sound of a name in the news decades later, into old age, into the astonishing and terrible fact that many survivors were still alive when D'Angelo was finally arrested, still carrying younger versions of themselves inside them. Younger selves who had waded through administrations, technologies, cultural changes, and the deaths of people they loved, all while the man who harmed them continued to exist in the world as an unnamed ordinary citizen. That fact is among the most emotionally powerful in the case. The victims aged, but the crimes did not vanish. They traveled with them, so when D'Angelo was finally identified, the moment was not merely evidentiary, it was biographical. For many survivors, it meant that a chapter they had never been allowed to close finally acquired a visible final page. Yet even then, justice could not restore what was lost. Which is why Part 3 cannot be told as a march toward eventual resolution. It has to stay with the victims where they actually lived. In homes, in marriages, in young adulthood, in motherhood, in fear, in memory, in the ordinary details of life interrupted. The woman locking the door, the husband turning out the bedside lamp, the child asleep in the next room. The couple who never imagined their address would matter to history, the person whose name later appeared on a list, but who first existed simply as someone loved. That is the true victim's story here. Not one life, but many. Not one wound, but a field of them. And at the center of all of it, the same intolerable truth. Joseph James DeAngelo did not merely commit crimes against individuals. He invaded the most private human spaces and forced the people inside them to carry his darkness long after he left. The incident never arrived in California the way people imagine evil arrives. It did not announce itself with a single unforgettable explosion or a body found under floodlights with police tape snapping in the wind. It arrived by repetition, by the same terrible grammar spoken over and over in different houses, on different nights, under different names, until the pattern itself became the incident. That is the first thing Part 4 must hold on to. In a case like this, there is no single midnight that can bear the full weight of what happened. There are many midnights, many bedrooms, many homes lying under darkness while a man moves toward them with intention already hardening inside him. The incident, then, is not merely one attack. It is the lived sequence of terror as it unfolded inside ordinary houses while Joseph James DeAngelo was still a rumor without a face. Still, to understand it emotionally, you have to enter one of those nights closely enough to feel the air change. Begin outside, a suburban California street after midnight. The lawns are silvered faintly under weak streetlight. Houses sit low and quiet behind fences and shrubs. Curtains are drawn. Somewhere a sprinkler clicks in a neighboring yard. Or a dog lifts its head and then settles again. The weather might be warm enough that a window has been cracked for air, or cool enough that the house feels sealed and safe. Either way, the family inside believes the night has already done what night is supposed to do. It has lowered the house into rest. The dishes are put away. The television is off. The last conversation has already happened. Someone may have read for a while. Someone may have checked the children once more before bed. Someone may have turned over under the blankets and exhaled into sleep with the full, trusting weight of a person who believes home is the final line. And then, somewhere outside that line, he is already there. He does not rush because rushing belongs to panic, and panic is not what governs him. What governs him is preparation. He knows yards. He knows side gates. He knows how to move close to a house without belonging to it. He knows which sounds disappear into the natural noises of the night and which ones might wake a sleeper into the sharpness of alarm. Sometimes he has been there before. Sometimes he has called the house days earlier, leaving behind an unease that no one could yet interpret correctly. Sometimes he has stood in the dark long enough to study the shape of the windows and the timing of the lights. That is what makes the incident so terrifying. It is not simply an eruption of violence. It is the final step in a private ritual of approach. By the time he enters, the crime has already begun in his mind many nights before. Inside the house, the victims are still asleep when the first boundary gives way. A side door, a window, a sliding glass entrance, something designed for comfort or convenience, becomes a point of invasion. In some homes, the first sensation is not visual at all. It is a disturbance in sleep, that primitive animal stirring before consciousness has assembled a reason. A shift in the room, a sound too deliberate to be the house settling. A pressure in the air. Then comes the flashlight, or the voice, or the sudden awareness that there is another human being in the darkness where no other human being should be. And this is the instant the incident truly begins. Not when he crosses the property line. Not when he enters the house, but when the victim understands, with the full horror of the waking body, that the bedroom no longer belongs to sleep, that it has been taken over, that someone has entered not only the room, but the rules of the room and rewritten them. He speaks. He commands. He imposes order with the confidence of a man who has rehearsed this in his mind until it feels less like improvisation than performance. His words are not loud in the way rage is loud. They are often controlled, the way a person speaks when they want domination more than noise. He uses fear not as a byproduct, but as an instrument. In homes where a woman is alone, the terror condenses instantly into a one-on-one chamber of psychological pressure. There is no one to wake, no one to intervene, no second consciousness to verify what is happening. The victim must absorb the entire reality alone. The beam of light, The silhouette, the sense that the room has narrowed down to the space between her and the man controlling it. Her body knows before her mind does that the universe has changed. Muscles go cold. Breath becomes shallow. Time begins to distort. A few seconds can expand enough to contain a lifetime of thought. Is this real? Is there a weapon? Can I move? Should I scream? Will screaming help? Is anyone near enough to hear? These thoughts do not arrive as complete sentences. They flicker through the body in panic, incomplete and physical. For couples, the incident becomes even crueler because he turns the relationship itself into part of the staging. The bedroom is no longer simply a place of shared rest. It becomes a room of forced helplessness. He binds. He positions. He controls not only movement, but the emotional atmosphere. The man in the bed is made to feel the uselessness of his own presence. The woman beside him is made to suffer under the gaze, proximity, and anguish of someone who loves her and cannot stop what is happening. It is hard to imagine a more intimate form of humiliation because it weaponizes the very structure that usually makes a bedroom feel safe. Partnership. He does not merely invade a house. He invades the bond between two people and leaves it altered forever. There is often a stillness in these incidents that is more horrifying than frantic noise. He wants compliance. He wants the victims to remain trapped inside anticipation. Because anticipation is its own form of suffering. The ticking of a clock becomes unbearable. The creak of the mattress becomes unbearable. A dog barking far away becomes unbearable because it continues to prove that the wider world is still moving while this room has been cut off from ordinary time. Victims later remember strange details because trauma often preserves the peripheral as fiercely as the central. The smell of the intruder, the rasp in his breathing, the shape of his shoulders in the dark, the way the hallway light from another room made a stripe across the floor, the texture of the blanket clenched in a fist. The knowledge that children might be nearby, the unbearable effort not to make the wrong sound. This is why the incident in a case like this cannot be reduced to a timeline of entry, control, assault, and departure. The true incident is also what happens inside the mind while those things are unfolding. The body is threatened. Yes, but so is the architecture of reality. The victim is forced into a state where home no longer means home, where night no longer means night, where a familiar room has become a cage administered by a stranger who knows exactly how much fear can fit inside a few square feet. He sometimes moves through the house with a confidence that feels almost supernatural to those trapped in the bedroom. Though it is nothing supernatural at all, it is planning. It is attention. It is his prior observation of the environment. His comfort with transgression, his ability to use darkness as cover and domestic space as terrain. To the victims, though, that movement can feel like omniscience. He knows where things are. He knows how to pass from one room to another. He seems to understand the house from the inside, even though he does not belong there. That sensation deepens the terror because it suggests a stranger who is somehow already intimate with your life. And intimacy without consent is one of the darkest threads in all his crimes. He learns people in order to violate them more completely. He listens in order to control more effectively. He studies in order to terrify more precisely. In some incidents, the psychological component begins before the physical one. There may have been prowling before the attack. Movements around the home, phone calls, disturbances designed either to test a response or to cultivate dread. That means the incident is not always confined to the night of the attack. It spills backward into previous evenings and forward into all the nights afterward. A woman who received strange calls days earlier may only later realize that terror had already entered her life before the bedroom assault itself. A couple who heard something in the yard and dismissed it may later discover that the incident had already begun outside the edge of consciousness. This stretched timeline is important because it reveals the offender's psychology. He is not merely committing crimes for immediate gratification or opportunistic access. He is constructing atmosphere. He wants to arrive not as a random intruder, but as the culmination of something. He wants his victims to feel that he has been around them, near them, learning them. Even before they can prove it, the effect is devastating because it robs them not only of a night, but of the nights preceding it. Reclassifying memory into menace. Once the crime is underway, ordinary domestic objects become part of the unbearable realism of it. A stack of magazines beside the bed, a half-full glass of water on a nightstand, family photographs in frames, a robe hanging on the back of the door, shoes waiting on the floor for a morning that now feels impossibly distant. In a child's room nearby, there may be toys, a small lamp, the breathing of someone too young to know what danger sounds like. These things matter because they are what the incident desecrates. Serial predation is always violent, but this case is especially haunting because it repeatedly violated settings that were thick with everyday tenderness and routine. He entered not abstract spaces, but real homes with accumulated life in them. That is why the aftermath of each incident was so lasting. Even after he left, the room still held all those objects. But their meanings had shifted. The bedside table no longer belonged to safety. The doorway no longer belonged to ordinary passage. The bed no longer belonged only to rest. During the assaults themselves, victims were often forced into a condition of acute sensory awareness. Some later recalled his muttering, his anger, his breathing, his pacing, his moments of strange, self-directed speech, the alternation between command and stillness. This is a crucial part of the incident because it offers a glimpse into the duality of the offender. He was capable of calculated control. Yet within that control, there were glimpses of inner turbulence, as though the discipline of the attack barely contained something more chaotic underneath. But that chaos did not help the victims. If anything, it made him harder to predict. Terror grows when a person controlling your life seems both methodical and unstable. It means there is no safe way to read the moment. Compliance may not calm him. Silence may not calm him. Nothing guarantees the next second. For the victims, the incident therefore became an ordeal of extreme psychological calculation under absolute powerlessness. Every breath had to be judged. Every movement had to be weighed against consequences they could not fully know. Then, eventually, he leaves, and this departure is its own special cruelty because it is rarely experienced as immediate relief. The body does not trust absence so quickly. The house still feels occupied by him even after the sound of him is gone. Victims remain frozen, listening, unsure whether he is truly outside, whether he has moved into another room, whether another sound means his return. Some cannot cry immediately. Some cannot move. Some begin to shake only once the body understands, too late, that it has survived. For couples, there is often a first glance at one another that must carry too much all at once. Love, horror, relief, helplessness, shame, disbelief. For a woman alone, the first motion after his departure may be toward a phone, a lock, a hallway, a lamp. Even that motion is no longer ordinary. It is the first act in a life that has been split into before and after. In the murder cases, the incident darkens further because departure no longer means survival for everyone involved. There, the sequence leads not to the stunned stillness of the living, but to silence of a different order. One that detectives and family members later have to reconstruct from scenes, timelines, and the testimony of absence. But even in the non-fatal attacks, the incident always contained a kind of death, the death of naive domestic trust, the death of the old meaning of night, the death of sleep as surrender without danger. This is why survivors often describe not just fear, but a permanent shift in perception. The house remains the same structurally, but it is no longer the same world. When you write the incident in a story like this, you must resist the easy temptation to make it cinematic in the wrong way. The real horror is quieter, more intimate, more humiliating than spectacle. It lives in the pause before a victim understands what is happening. In the controlled voice of the intruder, in the sound of drawers opened in a house that should be asleep, In the knowledge that children may be a few rooms away, in the flashlight moving across walls, the victims decorated themselves. In the body's instinctive plea to wake from something that is already more real than waking, that is the incident Joseph James DeAngelo created over and over in California. Not a single eruption, but a repeated occupation of private space by a man who understood exactly how to convert ordinariness into terror. He crossed lawns, entered homes, stood in bedrooms, and taught his victims the same lesson in slightly different forms. That safety could be peeled away one layer at a time by someone patient enough to study it first. And by the time the sun rose over those neighborhoods, over the same fences and roofs and sidewalks that had looked so normal the evening before, the incident was already larger than one house. It had entered memory, it had entered the nervous system. It had entered marriage, parenthood, solitude, and sleep. The offender was gone, but the night he carried with him stayed behind. By the time dawn began to thin the darkness over another California street, the crime scene had already changed shape several times. First, it was a bedroom. Then, it was a battlefield of breathing. Restraint, command, terror, and survival. Then, after he left, it became something else entirely, a place where the ordinary details of domestic life stood upright inside catastrophe, waiting to be interpreted by shaking hands, stunned eyes, and, eventually, investigators with flashlights, notebooks, cameras, and the burden of making sense of what the victims could barely bear to say aloud. In cases like these, the crime scene is never only a location. It is a wound in physical form. The bed is no longer just a bed. The hallway is no longer just a hallway, a dish in the kitchen, a lamp left on, a robe on the floor, a child's toy in the next room, a cup with water still in it on the nightstand. All of it becomes charged, not because the objects themselves changed, but because they now exist in a room where the rules of life were broken. Part 5. Then, must begin at that terrible hour just after the offender's absence becomes real enough to touch. The house is still standing. The street outside still looks like a suburban street. The sky may be paling faintly over fences and rooftops. A newspaper might soon land somewhere nearby with a slap on concrete. A milk truck or an early commuter may pass blocks away, but inside the home, time has been torn open. The first discovery is not necessarily made by police. It is made by the victims themselves. They see the room now in the aftermath of violation, and their eyes land not on one dramatic symbol, but on a pattern of wrongness, a drawer that should not be open, a blanket half off the bed, the strange placement of objects used for restraint, the window or door that marks where he entered or left, the sound of their own breathing. Too loud in the room, sometimes the discovery is their own bodies. The blunt and inescapable realization of what has been done and how completely the space around them has been turned into a stage for his control in homes where couples were attacked. The crime scene also includes the emotional distance of a few feet between two people who have just endured the same night in different bodies. One looks at the other and sees not only a loved one, but a witness. Another nervous system shocked into survival. That first glance is itself part of the discovery. It says this happened. It says we are still here. It says the room is going to have to be described to strangers now. The earliest moments after an attack are often thick with contradictory instincts. Lock everything. Leave everything untouched. Call for help. Wash. Hide. Turn on every light. Sit still. Find a child. Check the windows. Listen in case he is still outside. Trauma never arrives in tidy procedure. It comes in fragments. And because of that, the original crime scene is often partly altered before official eyes ever reach it. A victim may untie themselves or their partner. Someone may run to another room. A phone may be lifted with trembling hands. Lights are turned on. Doors opened, curtains moved. In the rawest human sense, all of this is completely natural. But in investigative terms, it means the scene is a conversation between what the offender left behind and what survival immediately required. That tension is essential in this case because many of these homes were not discovered as neat forensic tableaus. They were discovered as living spaces still occupied by people in shock. The initial clues therefore had to be read through distress, interrupted routines, and the victim's own attempts to reclaim movement after terror. When law enforcement entered these scenes, they were entering not only a possible source of physical evidence, but an atmosphere. Officers and detectives who worked these attacks often encountered a distinctive emotional signature. The house was intact. Yet not intact, nothing had exploded. The walls still stood, family photographs still hung in place. Kitchen counters still held yesterday's life, but the feeling was unmistakable. The domestic order had been penetrated. In some homes, there were signs of prowling or movement through multiple rooms. In others, items had been displaced with strange specificity. As if the offender had taken his time asserting knowledge of the space, the bed itself often became the center of gravity for the scene. Not merely because it was where the assault occurred, but because it represented everything the offender had chosen to violate. Sleep, intimacy, vulnerability, and trust. Around that center, detectives had to map a sequence. Where did he enter? How did he move? What did he touch? What did he say? What did he bring with him? What did he use from the victim's own house? These questions were not abstract. Each one carried the possibility of revealing the offender's habits, his preparation, his psychology, and, eventually, his identity. One of the most unsettling aspects of the early crime scene work in these cases was how often the offender appeared both organized and invasive. He did not merely stumble into houses. He selected, studied, and manipulated. That meant investigators looked for signs of prior familiarity, a gate left unlatched, a screen removed or tampered with, a route through the yard that suggested rehearsal. Sometimes there were indicators that the home had been watched before the attack or that the offender had tested access points in previous nights. In this sense, the crime scene did not always begin at the bedroom door. It began outside, at the perimeter, the side yard, the fence, the back gate, the alley if there was one, the stretch of grass or dirt where a prowler might kneel and listen. Those outdoor spaces mattered because they were often the first stage of his transformation from observer to intruder. Detectives had to widen the idea of scene beyond the house itself. A shoe impression in soft earth, a disturbed flower bed, a broken branch, a fence mark, a latent print on a window frame, a place where someone might have crouched long enough to watch the interior light patterns of a family getting ready for bed. These things could seem minor in daylight, but at the right moment, in the right sequence, they became the map of approach. Inside the house, the initial clues could be painfully intimate. Victims described flashlight use, commands, movement through the room, the handling of objects, the timing of threats, the locations where the offender stood or paced. Their accounts allowed investigators to reconstruct the choreography of fear, and that choreography itself became evidence. A criminal who enters, controls, binds, and assaults in a recurring pattern is revealing structure. Structure matters because it separates random brutality from signature behavior. It tells investigators that the man they are hunting has preferences, habits, an internal script. The placement of items on or near the bed, the sequence of commands, the way he used the victim's own environment to reinforce helplessness, all of that was part of the scene. These were not crimes in which evidence announced itself theatrically every time. Often, the most valuable clues were quiet, a footprint where it should not be, a point of entry too narrow for accident, a pattern repeated in another county, a phrase remembered by a victim. The victims themselves were, painfully, among the most important initial sources of evidence. Not because they owed the state perfect recall under impossible conditions, but because they had experienced details no camera had recorded and no neighbor had seen. The challenge, of course, was that trauma fractures memory even as it sharpens it. Survivors might recall the smell of the intruder more vividly than the exact order of his movements. They might remember the timbre of his voice, the way he muttered, the quality of his breathing, the direction of a flashlight beam, a sentence or fragment, while other details dissolved into panic. Investigators had to learn how to listen to memory that had been formed under threat. That is a highly specialized moral and practical task. If you press too hard, you risk deepening harm and producing confusion. If you fail to press carefully enough, you may lose the only access to certain aspects of the offender's behavior. In this case, those early victim interviews became crucial not just in building single-case files, but in recognizing recurring elements that would later help tie separate incidents together. The discovery phase was therefore not only what officers found with their eyes, but what they gathered from voices still shaking from the night. One of the reasons these crime scenes were so difficult to process was their deceptive normalcy. There was often no large-scale visual chaos of the kind associated with homicide scenes in the public imagination. Instead, there was a more corrosive form of disorder. The house looked livable, but not livable in the same way. The scene held the traces of someone who had entered another person's life with absolute entitlement. Drawers might be open, rooms disturbed, or objects handled in ways that made the victims feel observed, searched, known. In some homes, the offender appeared to take or move items in patterns that suggested he was not only committing a violent act, but staging psychological residue. He wanted the house to feel inhabited by him even after he was gone. This made the discovery phase spiritually ugly in a way that is difficult to exaggerate. A detective could stand in a perfectly respectable suburban bedroom and feel contamination without visible gore. That is because the offender's greatest mark on the scene was often not destruction in the ordinary sense, but domination. The room remained recognizable, yet it had been forced to host something that should never happen there. As the linked crimes expanded over time, investigators began noticing how the physical evidence from one scene resonated with another. Similar methods of entry, similar sequencing, similar behaviors, similar victim descriptions, similar emotional aftermath. What at first seemed like separate nightmares began to show connective tissue. That realization belongs partly to later investigative work, but its roots lie in these initial scenes. Every window frame dusted, every footprint photographed, every statement taken before memory could blur further. Every yard walked in daylight with heads bent low toward disturbed grass or impressions in dirt. All of it mattered because these were the raw materials of pattern recognition. In the era before modern genetic genealogy would revolutionize the case, pattern was one of the few bridges investigators had. The scene had to speak through repetition. The point of entry at one house did not just matter for that house. It mattered for another attack 50 miles away, or another one years later, where the same audacity, the same patience, and the same physical logic seemed to appear again. In some of the later murder scenes associated with the offender, the discovery shifted from survivor testimony to a more devastating form of evidence. There, detectives arrived to homes where silence had a different density. The house still contained life interrupted, but the people inside could no longer tell the story. In those scenes, physical clues carried an even heavier burden. The arrangement of the room, the signs of forced access, the condition of the victims, the ordinary objects left where they had last been used, a kitchen cup, an ashtray, shoes by the door, bedding disturbed. These details became the final witnesses of the dead, and even in those homes, the same broader truth remained. The offender had entered not a symbolic target, but a real life in progress. Discovery in a murder scene is always an assault on time. Investigators are forced to look at a house and reverse the stillness, to ask what the room looked like before violence, what order existed before someone crossed the threshold with lethal intent. In the Golden State Killer case, that reversal carried extraordinary emotional weight because the murders existed in continuity with earlier home invasions and assaults. The dead, too, belonged to a longer evolving pattern that investigators were only gradually able to comprehend. Early forensic work in these crimes was constrained by the period. Yet it was not primitive. Detectives gathered fingerprints, impressions, trace evidence, and detailed behavioral accounts. They studied neighborhoods and canvassed residents. They tracked prowling reports and suspicious phone calls. They examined ligatures, entry methods, and stolen items. Still, the case repeatedly exposed the limits of what could be resolved through scene work alone when the offender was disciplined. Mobile and operating across jurisdictions. That is why the crime scene in this story carries a kind of melancholy, even before we reach the later breakthrough. It gave investigators so much, and yet, for so long, not enough. The house could say he had been here. The victims could say what he sounded like, what he did, how he controlled the room. The yard could suggest how he approached. The neighborhood could provide sightings of strange behavior. But the central fact remained absent. No name. No face that held. No arrest that collapsed the horror into a single body. For the victims, that absence intensified the pain of discovery. It meant the room had been violated by someone who remained free to violate another. Every scene, once processed, carried not only the weight of what had happened, but the dread of recurrence elsewhere. That dread is part of the evidence too, not in a courtroom sense, but in the emotional truth of the case. Each discovered scene fed a larger social realization that this was not isolated. Somewhere, the man who had stood in this bedroom might stand in another one next week, next month, next year. The crime scene and the initial clues therefore mark more than the beginning of an investigation. They mark the beginning of a state of hauntedness in neighborhoods touched by these crimes. Houses were no longer just houses after police left. They became addresses associated with the possibility that terror could come from a lawn, a fence, a side gate, a sliding glass door. Victims remained in those structures or left them. But the memory remained architectural. A window remembered, a hallway remembered, a backyard remembered. And for investigators, each scene added another layer to a portrait still under construction. He was careful, but not invisible. He was repetitive, but adaptive. He was local in method, but broad in reach. The clues were there, stubbornly present in wood, soil, statements, and pattern, even if the technology and institutional structure of the time could not yet force them into full disclosure. That is what makes Part 5 so powerful in this story. The discovery was never simply a matter of finding evidence. It was the process by which ordinary homes began to reveal that one patient offender had been moving through them with terrifying consistency. A flashlight beam remembered by one victim became part of a larger language. A disturbed window screen became part of a larger route. A shaken account in one county echoed another account elsewhere. The scenes did not solve themselves, but they refused to stay isolated forever. And in every one of them, beneath the photographs, measurements, and reports, remained the same awful and deeply human truth. Someone had gone to sleep believing the house would protect them. And by morning, that belief had been left in pieces among the clues. By the time investigators began to feel the full scale of what they were facing, the case had already learned how to hide inside its own size. That is one of the cruelest truths of Part 6. In simpler stories, investigation moves in a line. A crime happens, clues are gathered, suspects are narrowed, the right pressure is applied, and the truth begins to harden into a shape that can be named. But in the long, fractured pursuit of the man who would later be known as the Golden State Killer, the investigation did not move like a line. It moved like a body feeling its way through a dark house, touching walls, opening doors, hearing something at one end of the hallway only to find silence when it got there. This was not because detectives were indifferent or unimaginative. On the contrary, Many of them understood early that they were confronting something methodical, something recurring, something more disciplined than the usual run of burglaries and assaults. The problem was that the offender had done what the best predators always do. He had turned time, geography, and institutional separation into weapons. He did not merely commit crimes. He arranged them across places and phases in ways that made pattern recognition slower than fear. And while communities were already whispering about a prowler, a rapist, a stalker, a night figure with a flashlight and a voice that entered dreams long after he left the room, the official structures trying to contain him had to fight not only his cunning, but the natural fragmentation of law enforcement itself. In the Sacramento area assaults, detectives worked hard, canvassed neighborhoods, studied entry points, listened to victims, looked for sequence and signature. But even within one region, the sheer number of leads could be paralyzing. A serial predator produces an especially toxic investigative environment because he generates not only evidence but static. Every suspicious man in the neighborhood becomes interesting. Every peeping incident seems potentially linked. Every prowler call, every anonymous hang-up, every strange car parked too long at the curb, every man seen walking alone after dark starts to pulse with significance. People who had never before thought of themselves as witnesses began trying to remember ordinary details with courtroom intensity. A face near a fence, a bicycle on the wrong street, a man at a hardware store, a sound in the side yard. But memory under fear is both vivid and treacherous. It gives you fragments sharpened by dread and leaves you uncertain about the edges. Detectives had to sort through all of that while the attacks continued. That is what makes the investigative phase feel so suffocating. The case did not suffer from a lack of effort. It suffered from an excess of possibilities and an offender who understood how to remain plausible in ordinary daylight while monstrous at night. Early on, the suspect pool naturally widened toward men who fit one or more parts of the profile. A man with prowling tendencies, a man known for burglary, someone with military bearing, someone familiar with neighborhoods, perhaps with police routines, perhaps with local geography in a way that exceeded chance. Victims often described certain consistencies in his behavior and voice, but no single description could collapse the uncertainty. Physical appearance remembered through trauma is difficult enough when there is light and time. Here, recollection had to be extracted from darkness, flashlights, shock, and the body's animal determination to survive. So suspects came and went. Some were local men with histories that made them look promising from a distance. Some were known offenders whose habits overlapped just enough to tempt investigators. Some were men whose names appeared because a girlfriend, a neighbor, or an ex-wife thought their anger or oddness deserved a look. Some were simply in the wrong place in the era before clean, rapid elimination was possible. The investigation developed that exhausting rhythm familiar to anyone who has worked a sprawling, unsolved series. A name would gain heat. People would start leaning toward it. Interviews would be done, comparisons made, possibilities tested. And then the line would cool again, not because detectives were incompetent, but because the suspect was not there or not yet visible, or hidden behind the fact that he could live a life which, from the outside, did not announce his internal architecture. One of the most maddening aspects of the case was the offender's evolution. If he had remained only one thing in one region, perhaps the investigative story would have narrowed sooner. But he did not. The figure associated with prowling, burglary, and sexual assault in one phase seemed to mutate into something broader and deadlier in another. That meant the investigation was always chasing a moving silhouette. Was this the same man developing, escalating, adapting? Or were multiple offenders being forced together by fear and pattern seeking? That question poisoned clarity for years. It was not irrational. In fact, it was one of the most responsible questions detectives could ask, because the danger in a major serial case is not only missing the pattern, but over-asserting one too soon and warping every future lead around a mistaken narrative. Some investigators believed deeply in the links. Others were more cautious, sometimes because the jurisdictions were different. The methods seemed modified, or the evidence did not yet force the issue. This is one of the quiet tragedies of pre-digital investigative life. Two smart people in two different counties can each hold half the shape of a monster and still not see the whole thing at the same time. The dead ends were not just dead ends of evidence, they were dead ends of coordination. Dead ends of timing, dead ends of institutional confidence. Then there was the offender's behavioral intelligence. He did not leave investigators nothing. Cases like this never truly leave nothing, but he left the kind of evidence that can haunt rather than resolve. A shoe print, a mode of entry, a remembered phrase, a sequence of control, the style of prowling before attack, the strange blend of organization and inner agitation. These details mattered enormously, but they did not automatically reveal a name. They built a profile, a behavioral center of gravity. A sense of how he thought, how he moved, what he needed from the crime, and yet still failed to drag him into daylight. That is the psychological heart of the dead-end phase. The investigators were not chasing emptiness. They were chasing a man they could almost feel in the room. They knew he was disciplined. They knew he liked control more than spectacle. They knew he used fear as structure, not accident. They knew he often prepared, watched, tested. They may have suspected he was comfortable with procedure, perhaps with authority, perhaps with compartmentalization, but knowledge without identity becomes a kind of torment. You begin to feel that the man is not absent from the case at all. He is everywhere in it except the place where you can arrest him. The public pressure only deepened the problem. By the time the East Area Rapist name had taken hold, fear had already become communal. Neighborhood meetings, self-defense advice, patrols, warning systems, media briefings. All of it created an atmosphere where everyone wanted resolution immediately, and when a case becomes part of public panic, investigators inherit a second burden beyond finding the truth. They must also manage the volume of false certainty. Calls pour in, tips multiply. People begin offering names with complete emotional conviction and minimal evidentiary value. A suspicious boyfriend, a rude coworker, a man who owns boots, a neighbor with odd habits, a drifter seen near a canal. The machinery of public anxiety can produce as many bad suspects as real clues, and because the stakes were so high, because women and couples were being attacked in their homes, those leads could not simply be dismissed with a shrug. They had to be checked, however quickly, however imperfectly, however often they dissolved into nothing. Every dead lead stole time from deeper work. Every false suspect carried the risk of tunnel vision. Every rumor made the atmosphere thicker. It is difficult to appreciate from the outside how exhausting such an investigative climate becomes. The detectives were not just solving crimes. They were trying to think clearly inside a storm of fear. In some phases of the case, there were men who looked extremely promising. Men whose histories, habits, locations, or temperaments seemed to align. There were suspects who inspired real investigative heat, men who were surveilled, interviewed, searched, compared, and in some cases nearly mythologized inside the case culture as possible answers. This is common in long unsolved investigations. An especially persuasive suspect can become a kind of emotional anchor, a way for detectives to imagine that the years of work are finally tightening around the right throat. But if the suspect is wrong, the collapse afterward is brutal. It is not only the loss of a lead, it is the loss of momentum, confidence, and psychic energy. Some investigators carry wrong suspects in their memory for decades. Not because they were foolish, but because the wrong suspect once looked so much like closure. The Golden State case collected many such ghosts. Some were local men. Some were violent